This is meaningful learning and schema theory, cognitive information processing, self-regulated learning. This is the Module 2 Critical Review by LaPlace. Theories originate with questions, and those questions lead researchers to conduct observations. Theories give us a framework for making sense of the data that it was collected, and the theories in this presentation show how knowledge is received and processed and ultimately retained as learned. Theories of learning attempt to answer what learning is, how it occurs, and how do we know if learning has occurred, and of course how to get others to learn and learn more efficiently. Meaningful learning focuses on school learning. The main idea of Ausubel's meaningful reception learning is all knowledge is organized in a hierarchy and new information is meaningful based on how it can be related to what is already known. Ausubel talked of derivative subsumption, which is adding to an existing body of knowledge. Correlative subsumption, which is somehow changing or modifying an existing understanding of a knowledge or a skill to accommodate some new learning. Superordinate learning is learning that brings together an existing set of knowledge or skills under a new, more comprehensive level of understanding. And combinatorial learning is learning by an analogy, when new learning combines two or more existing knowledges or skills into a single new concept. So derivative subsumption would be if a student had learned a basic concept of a tree. They know trees have a trunk that grows into branches and has green leaves on the end of the branches. Then a student is taught about a willow tree. The concept of the tree remains the same while adding another example of a type of tree. In correlative subsumption, if the student then learns many trees also produce fruit or nuts, the concept of a tree has been altered to include the possibility of producing fruit or nuts. Superordinate learning would be when a student that is very familiar with different types of trees, such as oaks, pecan, and apple trees, then learns they are called deciduous trees and are classified as such. Combinatorial learning is when a student discovers that a banana tree has a false trunk and is really just a large herb plant. Ausubel's theory suggests how to arrange the conditions to make learning easier and more acceptable to the student. The focus is on meaningful learning and not rote learning or memorization. He was focused on how students receive learning and felt it was much more efficient than discovery learning. Uses of Ausubel's theory in today's classroom include the advanced organizer, the comparative organizer, and elaboration or progressive differentiation. The advanced organizer is useful in activating prior knowledge and showing what the learner already knows and how that learning fits into the new knowledge they are to learn. Comparative organizers are used to show how learning is related. It is used to show comparison and contrast between learning concepts. The purpose of progressive differentiation is to clarify anchoring ideas while increasing the level of detail with each level of instruction. Schema theory begins with schema that are basically packets of knowledge, according to Driscoll. And schema theory is how learners use those packets to construct meaning and create learning. Mental models are schemata that guide performance and procedures, as well as problem solving. Procedures for schema acquisition and modification include accretion, tuning, and restructuring. Accretion occurs when a learner adds to an existing schema without altering the current schema. This correlates to Ausubel's derivative subsumption. Tuning occurs when schema is updated to better match some new information or experience. Tuning is equivalent to correlative subsumption. Restructuring is the creation of a new schema, either replacing one that no longer fits the learner's knowledge and skills, or by combining existing schemata. Restructuring is equivalent to either superordinate or combinatorial learning, depending on the situation or the experience of the learner. The implications of meaningful learning and schema theory for instructors are to provide learners with an overall theme and then show how each unit of instruction fits into the total learning. Both theories suggest teaching problem-solving skills as well as calling attention to ways information is organized that will lead to better teaching and learning. Instructors need to discover the learner's schema and then determine what needs to be accreted, tuned, or restructured to change the learner's schemata. Cognitive information processing is concerned with the basic mental functions, mainly how we sense, perceive, process, store, and retrieve events and information. The components of memory proposed by this theory are the sensory register, short-term or working memory, and long-term memory. So beginning with the sensory register, in order for information to be entered into our long-term memory, it first must register with us. We assign meaning to different sensory impressions depending on our background knowledge and experience. The information then moves into short-term memory, or also called working memory. Theorists have found that we can only hold about 7 chunks of information at a time in our short-term memory. And in order for that to move into long-term memory, we have to be able to rehearse them or encode them in some way to move them into long-term memory. Rehearsing mnemonics or any other memorization type skill is good for moving it into long-term memory, but theorists have found that encoding strategies and meaningfulness to us, relating it to other information that we currently have, is a much more effective way of moving information into our long-term memory. There are some basic concepts within long-term memory, such as declarative versus procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is basically broken down into episodic and semantic memory, or memory for events and memory for verbal information. There are verbal and imaginal representations in memory, and the imaginal representation is much easier for us to recall because we can have that picture in our mind, and it is much easier to remember than the abstract. In order to retrieve information, there is a difference between recalling the task and recognizing a task. So that's why teachers love to use multiple choice tests, because students will recognize the answer or some part of the definition instead of being able to directly recall the entire thing from memory. Self-regulated learning is when the learner actually takes control of their own learning and they can actually think about how they think metacognitively. Behaviorally, they actually set goals based on learning, and motivationally, they reflect and adapt and change what they do and how they think in order to learn more efficiently. In the forethought phase, there is goal setting, strategic planning, actual self-efficacy beliefs, believing that they can learn, a goal orientation, and a very intrinsic interest in their own learning. In the performance control phase, they pick out what strategies to use, monitor their way of thinking, their metacognitive way of thinking, and they self-record how they learn and self-monitor their progress. In the self-reflection phase, they evaluate how they learned and then adapt to how they can make it work better for them. Keller's model of motivational design insists on the 4 conditions for motivation: attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. Gaining attention is one of the requirements for learners to be successful. Establishing relevance is relating the new material to the learner's needs and also the things that they have learned already, making that connection and making it familiar for the learner. Building confidence is that self-efficacy of believing in themselves and believing they can accomplish the tasks and goals set for their learning. And of course, generating satisfaction is giving the learners a chance to try and be successful with the new knowledge and skills that they are learning. Because meaningful learning and schema theory focus on the structure of knowledge as opposed to how to process that knowledge, using mental maps or concept maps is the best way to make sure that learners attach their current schema to the new schema and increase their learning. So advance and comparative organizers are definitely one of the things that have lasted throughout this theory, and letting instructors show learners where their learning fits and where the gaps are in their learning. CIP is the processing that it occurs between your ears inside the brain. The learner takes a more active role in this theory, especially within their own learning, and knowing how the brain processes information really helps instructors organize better instruction and create more successful learning. Implications for instruction include organizing instruction using lots of graphic organizers, linking new information to what is already known, and also understanding and appreciating the limits of that short-term memory, that rule of 7. Also helping learners become self-regulated, which leads us into our next theory of self-regulated learning. Motivation drives human behavior. Everything we do each day is motivated by something. We're motivated to get out of bed, to increase our knowledge and learning, or we may just be fearful that our mother would come and throw water on us. The goal of every teacher is to have a classroom of self-regulated learners. And self-regulated learning and motivation are very relevant in today's classroom. And this theory puts the learner in the driver's seat of their own education. making them accountable for their own thought process and improvement. Keller's model becomes a how-to manual for the instructor, and the strategies are very relevant and adaptable to any learning situation. Keller's ARC model identifies the necessary components of motivation when in an instructional setting. These are attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. Attention must be gained and sustained and can be done by using curiosity and varying the presentation style of the instructor. The relevance has to be enhanced and increased and matched to the learner's motives and values. Building confidence and self-efficacy can be done by giving very clear and attainable expectations, and that will generate satisfaction for the learner as they find success in their learning. Module 2 has examined theories of meaningful learning and schema theory, cognitive information processing, self-regulated learning, and motivation. Each of these theories has moved the learner from a passive participant into an active role and taking control of their own learning within the classroom. Cognitivism theorizes how information goes through the senses, gets processed, stored, and used. And the focus is explaining these processes of learning as they happen inside the head. No single theory can account for the total learning process, and a theory of learning may not prescribe the best way to teach, but will give the instructor a much greater insight of how a student learns and how they can increase their learning and give the instructor a better chance for success.